Well, hello and welcome to a seminar that I'm teaching called The Rise of Christianity. This is the introduction to the seminar, and the title is kind of self-explanatory. We're interested in this seminar on showing explanations for how it is that Christianity became as big as it is today. In fact, in this seminar, we're mostly focused on how Christianity grew in the first 200 some odd years of its existence, when there were factors kind of working against it. So basically, none of us living in this day have ever lived at a time when Christianity was not huge. I mean, right now there are over 7 billion people in the world, and over 2 billion of them say they are Christian. So none of us have ever lived in a time when Christianity wasn't huge. But there was a time when Christianity was very small. In fact, in the New Testament, at the end of the New Testament, even after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, the church was huddled in an upper room in Jerusalem, and they says that there was about 120 believers. So the church was at one time very small, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And a lot of the growth, exponential growth, happened in the years between Jesus' ascension and about the year 300. And that's the period of time that I want to focus on in this particular series. Now, of course, the fact that the church would grow was something that Jesus prophesied about. He said that there would be growth. He used a lot of agricultural parables to talk about the growth of the kingdom. But I wanted to get us started with a parable that Jesus told from Mark chapter 4. And this just kind of talks about that growth. It says, "This is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it, because the harvest has come." The idea here is that when you plant a seed, it starts out very small, but over time, slowly, you have to be patient. It grows, and eventually there will be a harvest. And so there's lots of other scriptures we could turn to. This is the online version of the seminar, so it's actually quite a bit shorter than the actual physical presentations. And so we'll not go through all those scriptures, but I did want to start by focusing on some of the resources that are behind this seminar. So there's basically 6 books that have been the main sources to what I'm sharing in this class. The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark is where I got the title from, and it's an excellent book that talks about how it is that Christianity rose, and it's written by a sociologist, Rodney Stark, and so he has a lot of interesting insights into how movements start. And so that's an excellent book. The Patient Ferment of the Early Church is one of my all-time favorite books. It's by Alan Kreider, and he talks about the church in the first few centuries and how it is that they just slowly, methodically grew. Larry Hurtado's Destroyer of the Gods is another excellent book that really focuses on how Christianity changed the meaning of religion and kind of overthrew the religions of the day, so that we don't even always recognize the changes that were brought about by Christianity. A lot of times we're living off the fumes of those changes without recognizing that Christianity played the role in bringing about the world that we live in. We also have a book down on the bottom left of your screen called Christianity at the Crossroads, and that is by Michael Kruger. And it's actually a very similar book to Larry Hurtado's book, with the exception that Kruger focuses exclusively on the 2nd century. But they wrote these books, I believe, around the same time, and they're very similar books, and they were later aware of each other's work, but very similar books. Robert Louis Wilken is a historian, and he wrote this book called The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. And this one kind of comes at it from a different angle. What did non-Christian people think of this emerging movement that we now call Christianity? And then I added a sixth book right at the end because I'd read it before and I knew that it had some things to say in regards to this topic. And so this is a book called When the Church Was a Family. It's one of my favorites, and it's by Joseph Hellerman. And he really just talks about the family nature of the early church. So those are the resources that are behind this work. I'd love to hear that you took the time to invest in those books and read them yourselves. All right, I want to start with a chart from Rodney Stark's book, and this is a chart that shows a kind of an estimate of the growth of Christianity. If we're going to do a class called The Rise of Christianity, we better have some awareness of what that rise really looked like in terms of numbers. So these are estimates. This is not perfect. In fact, I tend to think he's a little low on his early number estimates, and he's just kind of borrowing these from other people who have studied this topic. But I think he's a little low at the beginning and probably a little high at the end. But in general, this is a pretty good portrayal of the growth that Christianity experienced in the first 300 years of its existence. So in the year 50, he says there were maybe about 1,400 Christians, and you can see what a low percentage of the Roman world's population was. The population of the Roman world at this time was probably in the neighborhood of 60 million people. So by the year 100, you're up to 7,000, and then 150, 40,000. By the year 200, 217,000. By the year 250, just over 1 million. And then by the year 300, which is kind of where our study is going to end, you're already up to 6 million. Now, it's after that that you see this big explosion up to 33 million. But my point that I want to make is the ratio of growth was actually the same throughout. You're basically multiplying by 6 to get to each one of these numbers. So from 1,400 to 7,500, you're kind of multiplying by about 6 all the way down through, and that's what exponential growth is like. So that we'll talk kind of about why that causes an issue for some people when it gets to that huge 33 million number, and they try to explain the growth of the church by something that happened in the early 300s. But I want to stop our study right around 300 and say it was already growing. So this was really exponential growth that was taking place. Now, I don't want you to take just Rodney Stark's information as the only source here, so I wanted to show you some other quotes from some of these guys that were talking about this. So Wilken said this. He said around 100 AD, he said this about that time, about the year 100 AD, the total number of Christians within the empire was probably less than 50,000, an infinitesimal number in a society comprising 60 million. The Jews, by contrast, were a significant minority, numbering 4 to 5 million. Most inhabitants of the Roman Empire had never heard of Christianity, and very few had any first-hand contact with Christians. So this is a good quote because it kind of shows that around the year 100, he's kind of in agreement with Stark for the most part, that there was a good number of Christians, but it was still a very small amount compared to the larger Roman world. All right. We also have a quote from Kruger about around the year 200. He's talking about this period of time. He said, during these 100 years, from 100 to 200, the fledgling Christian movement made enormous strides, geographically, numerically, demographically, structurally, and theologically, so much so that by the end of the 2nd century, Christianity was on a path of ascendancy that would eventually culminate in its becoming the dominant force of the Roman Empire just a few generations later. So by the year 200, Christianity well on its way to just an incredible amount of growth. And then Kreider, commenting on the situation around the year 300, he says the period from 260 to 300 has been called 40 years of peace. During these decades, Christians were able to put down roots, gain confidence, and grow substantially in numbers. However, it seems likely that the church's adherents across the empire totaled less than the widely accepted figure of 10%, or 6 million, as you would have seen at the end of Stark's chart. So he's just saying there's a little caution there. We don't know for sure that Christianity was quite that big, but it was definitely more than 1 million. It was not like it was a couple 100,000. It was more than 1 million, but maybe not quite up to 6 million by the year 300. So here's a map of what we're talking about. You might notice a couple things about this map. You have the dark orange areas are where Christianity by the year 300 was over 50% of the population. So you have a big area in northern Syria, and then you have a big area in what we would call Western Turkey today, and then Constantinople area, and then over here in North Africa and Carthage. So there's lots of growth, and then the light orange areas are areas where you're approaching 50% of the population being Christian. So just a couple. That's kind of, now that might not seem super impressive to you after 250 years or so of growth, but you got to remember this was something that was 120 people in Palestine or Israel. So this is, and then all those boxes on the map represent churches that Christian communities that were in existence since the first century. So you can see it was really starting to take off by the year 300. All right, now the fact that it was taking off from this small number to this large number is somewhat mysterious to historians for a number of reasons, and I want to first focus on the reason that most new religions just do not survive or thrive. You know, it's just not common for new religions to survive and thrive. I'll give you a quote to get us started here, which says this: although hundreds of new religious movements appear annually, virtually every new group will have one thing in common: eventual failure. Probably no more than one religious movement out of 1,000 will attract more than 100,000 followers and last for as long as a century. So it's pretty easy to start a new religion, actually. I could start one right now. I could say, like, you that were watching this video, you should begin to worship me because I'm awesome, and that would be a terrible religion. But, I mean, I could try to start it. And if, you know, no one would probably join my religion, therefore my religion would eventually fail. It would die out with the death of me. But some religions have a little bit better record than that. They might gain hundreds of adherents or thousands of adherents. They might last 3 years, 10 years. But very few new religions acquire 100,000 followers at any point or last more than a century. Very few. So it is mysterious that this particular religion that we refer to as Christianity was able to buck the trend, as just very few religions have. So another reason why this is mysterious growth is that Christianity had such humble beginnings. I mean, it would be almost understandable if somebody started a new religion because after they like conquered some huge part of the world through military force, like if a military commander decided that he needed to be worshipped after a great victory and his soldiers bowed down to him. That would be somewhat understandable how a religion might start in such circumstances. But we're here talking about a Jewish peasant born in a manger scene starting this faith that we call Christianity. And it's got very humble beginnings, so that also makes it mysterious to historians. And then we see Kreider kind of commenting on that. Why did this minor mystery religion from the Eastern Mediterranean, marginal, despised, discriminated against, why did it grow substantially, eventually supplanting the well-endowed, respectable cults that were supported by the empire and the aristocracy? So this is the question that we're asking in this class. And then the third reason why the growth of the church is mysterious is that there were real disincentives against Christianity. For instance, here's a couple of quotes. Kreider says there were good reasons not to become a Christian. Disincentives were strong. If you became a Christian, you could be gossiped about, you could be made sport of by workmates, get in trouble with your master, be suspect to your neighbors. At times, becoming a believer could get you jailed, sent to the mines, or killed. And there was a luxuriant variety of other religions to choose from. So it's not like he didn't have other choices that were less costly. Jesus himself said there's a cost to following him. And so this is mysterious to especially secular historians. How did the church grow with so many disincentives, with such humble beginnings? when most religions don't grow, how did the church grow? Your actual chances of being executed as a Christian were probably limited, but there were other and much more frequent costs as well as being a Christian in the first 3 centuries. For example, you might receive harassment or ostracism from family members, friends, and associates. Don't downplay that. I mean, this is still true sometimes today, but it was true most all the time back then. To become a Christian was to basically be excommunicated from your social network. So this was a real disadvantage to becoming Christian and a disincentive from becoming Christian. So how do we explain this mystery? Well, some say that Christianity owes its growth to Emperor Constantine. So I don't know if you know the story, but in the early 300s, Constantine claims to have had a vision and interpreted that as the God of Christianity speaking to him. And so he is, in some sense, became a Christian. He became an advocate for the Christian God. And so once that happened, the conversion, or so-called conversion of the emperor, the empire essentially became Christian in many ways. Certainly they began to tolerate Christianity much more than they had, but for the most part, more and more, it became kind of the religion of the empire because the emperor was of that religion. And so many people it now became advantageous. Instead of disincentives, there were now incentives to become Christians. So some people try to explain the growth of Christianity by that moment. They say that Christianity was just this small group of people until Constantine converted, and then it started to really grow. And the problem with that theory or that thesis is that it's just not true. That is not how Christianity grew. As you saw in the chart earlier, there's the estimates are that it was growing substantially and exponentially before that. In fact, we might ask the question, how in the world would the emperor of the Roman Empire even hear of Christianity, let alone become a Christian and spread Christianity? How would he have heard of it if it was just a small backwoods movement at that time? So here's a couple quotes, one from Stark. Rather than cause the triumph of Christianity, the Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan was an astute response to rapid Christian growth that had already made them a major political force. Or Hurtado says, Christianity did not become successful through Constantine giving it imperial approval. Instead, Constantine adopted Christianity likely because it had already become so successful, despite earlier efforts to destroy the movement. So that's a poor explanation. Another poor explanation is that Christianity owes its growth to force. This is kind of a pop level. I think a lot of people in our world today, they see the history of Christianity and they just assume that it's this powerful institution that just put all its detractors down. And that's just not really understanding the history of the first couple centuries of Christianity. Christianity was not a powerful force, at least not in the worldly sense of the term. It was just a small group of people that was growing, but it wasn't. It didn't have any military power. They didn't have any weapons. In fact, they were pacifists. So this is kind of a pop view, but it's not held by any scholars. A few centuries later, there was a religion that started by force. Islam spread with remarkable success, but from its earliest moments, Islam's successes were often at the point of the sword. By contrast, the growth of Christianity in its first 3 centuries was the most crucial period, was largely by a combination of the power of persuasion, whether in preaching, intellectual argument, miracles, exhibiting the power of Jesus' name, and simply the moral suasion of Christian behavior, including martyrdom. So that's Hurtado that said that. So another poor explanation for the mysterious growth of Christianity is that Christianity owes its growth to strategy. Now, I hesitate to say this one a little bit because there is some merit to the idea that Christians had some strategy in how they spread across the Roman Empire. But I do want to show you some quotes that kind of speak against this. This one from Kreider. According to the evidence at our disposal, the expansion of the churches was not organized, the product of a mission program. It simply happened. The growth was not carefully thought through. In fact, after the apostles went out as missionaries around the world, there's really not much evidence of missionary activity. It's kind of like they just planted churches in the first century, and then they waited for it to patiently grow. And so we have a quote here that it wasn't really a strategic thing. So I think that's also a poor explanation. And that brings us to kind of this final quote that I want to show, and that is, finally, all questions concerning the rise of Christianity are one. How was it done? If none of those explanations worked, if those were bad explanations, then what is the explanation? And Stark here says, how did a tiny and obscure messianic movement from the edge of the Roman Empire dislodge classical paganism and become the dominant faith of Western civilization? Although this is the only question, it requires many answers. No one thing led to the triumph of Christianity. Now, I will end this first part of the presentation there because that's really the question that we're going to look at for the rest of this. So this will be a playlist, and you can click on the next one to start to see some of the explanations that I gathered and collected from these 6 great books, these great resources. But this is the question we're going to ask. How did Christianity rise? How do we account for this? There are, I think, there's not just one explanation. I'm going to give you a series of explanations that I think each play a part. And so beginning with the second video in this playlist, we'll look at explanations for the rise of Christianity. I hope you've enjoyed this first introductory session, and hope that you continue watching.